They always say you should trust your gut, but when you've been married for over 30 years, you start trusting routine instead. You believe the smile he gives you when he walks through the front door, the light kiss on the cheek, the way he drops his suitcase by the stairs and tells you he missed your cooking. You believe those things because they're easier to hold on to than suspicion. But what if I told you that the moment my husband came back from his so-called business trip, smiling and humming and completely unaware of what was about to unfold, I already knew. I already knew everything, and what I had waiting for him would rip the floor right out from under his feet. That night was the first time in years I truly saw his face. Not the one he wore for me, but the one he wore when he realized the game was over. And let me tell you, it was not a pretty sight. My name is Mary, and I'm 61 years old. I spent most of my life being the kind of woman people call dependable, gracious, and strong in a quiet way. I was the mother who never missed a parent-teacher meeting, the wife who ironed shirts even when I was sick, the daughter-in-law who took care of my husband's mother until her last breath. I never asked for much, and I certainly never expected the man I married to turn my entire world upside down when I was just trying to grow old in peace. That afternoon, when his car pulled into the driveway and I saw him step out wearing that same navy blazer he always traveled in, everything looked so normal. The birds were chirping, the sun was warm on the roses I had just trimmed, and our dog Barkley ran to the gate like he always did. But inside, I felt nothing but ice. Because 3 hours earlier I had returned from a trip of my own, not to visit my sister in Ohio, like I had told him, but to a small town 2 states over, where I had checked into a modest hotel across the street from the Hilton where he was staying. I didn't need fancy spy gear or a private investigator. All I needed was my phone, a camera lens, and a quiet place to watch. He didn't see me when he stepped out of the Hilton on the second night with a younger woman hanging on his arm like she belonged there. She couldn't have been older than 35, dressed like someone who shops with a personal stylist, with long dark hair and a polished look that screamed kept. But it wasn't her that made my stomach drop. It was the little boy holding her hand, with a mop of sandy blonde curls and the same sharp green eyes as my youngest son. I had to grip the edge of the window ledge to keep from losing my balance. And that was just the beginning. So when he walked through the door that day, all bright and cheerful, asking how the garden was doing and joking about some client who snored during their board meeting, I just smiled and handed him a glass of iced tea. I told him dinner would be ready in an hour. He didn't notice that I never once looked him in the eye. And when he went upstairs to unpack and I heard the thud of his suitcase on the bed, I quietly stepped into the den and opened the small wooden box I had brought back with me. Inside were the photos, printed, not digital, black and white, just like he preferred when we used to develop vacation pictures in the 90s. But these weren't vacation shots. These were truth. These were the receipts of betrayal, taken over the course of 5 days, from every angle. Him laughing, him kissing her forehead, him holding that little boy's backpack like a proud father. He had no idea what I had seen, no idea where I had been. He thought I had spent the week knitting and watching murder mysteries with my sister. But I had spent that time watching my marriage crumble silently from the other side of a hotel window. And now, as I heard him call out, asking if I had remembered to grab milk, I calmly answered yes and slid the photos back into the box. Because this wasn't the time for a confrontation. Not yet. I had learned one thing in my 61 years. When you strike back, it's best to do it cleanly and without ever raising your voice. I spent the rest of that evening moving through the house like a ghost, quietly setting the table, checking the oven, folding the kitchen towel a little too neatly over the stove handle, doing everything I had done for years. But now, with a numbness in my chest I couldn't quite shake off. He talked through dinner like he always did, telling stories from his trip, bragging about a tough negotiation he had supposedly won in Chicago, naming a client I recognized from his work calendar, and even tossing in a joke about how boring conference food had been. I smiled when I had to, nodded when it was expected, and kept my eyes on the mashed potatoes because I was afraid if I looked at him too long, the mask I had glued to my face would start to crack. He never asked me a single question about my week, not where I'd been, not who I saw, not how my sister's knees were doing, even though she supposedly just had a minor surgery. That should have made me angry, but all I felt was relief. The less he asked, the safer my silence was, and I was clinging to that silence like it was the only thing keeping me upright. After dinner, he carried his plate to the sink like the perfect husband, kissed my cheek in that way that used to make me feel cherished, and headed to the living room to turn on the news. I stared at his half-empty glass of sweet tea, the condensation slowly pooling into a ring on the wood, and wondered how many times I had looked at this same scene and thought everything was fine. But tonight, I knew better. Tonight, I knew I was living with a stranger who had been rehearsing this performance for years. And then, just as I was rinsing a plate, something inside me shifted. I don't know what made me do it. Maybe it was the weight of the years I had given him. Maybe it was the picture of that little boy in my mind. Or maybe it was just the sound of his voice echoing from the living room like nothing had happened. But I suddenly dried my hands, walked upstairs, and climbed up into the attic. I hadn't been up there in months, maybe longer. The wooden ladder creaked the same way it always had, and the air was heavy with dust and insulation and the faint smell of old photo albums and Christmas decorations. I reached for the string that turned on the single yellow bulb hanging from the ceiling, and the light flickered to life like it was surprised to be called upon. I didn't know what I was looking for. I didn't even know why I was looking. But I started opening old boxes, one after another, my fingers trembling slightly, as I sifted through forgotten belongings from a life I had once believed was real. There were baby shoes, old tax returns, a box of VHS tapes labeled Vacation 1993, and a worn-out briefcase I hadn't seen in decades. But then, tucked behind an old trunk filled with winter coats, I found something I didn't recognize at all. A sleek black box, newer than anything else up there. No label, no dust, like it had been placed there recently. I crouched down, heart thumping in my ears, and slowly opened the lid. Inside was a stack of envelopes, dozens of them, each one addressed in my husband's handwriting, but not to me. Some had stamps, some had notes like, "Do not forward" or "personal." All of them were sent to a different address not far from the hotel he had stayed at. But it wasn't just the letters that made my breath catch in my throat. It was the photographs tucked beneath them, snapshots of a woman, that woman, with her hair shorter, her face younger, her holding a baby, then a toddler, then a boy growing into the child I had seen just days ago. There were birthday cards in his handwriting, receipts for school supplies, even a small drawing made by a child's hand that read, "To Dad." And that's when I knew. This wasn't just an affair. This was a second life. A second life. I don't remember how long I sat there staring at those papers, my knees aching from the cold floorboards, my hands shaking with a strange combination of fury and clarity. The pieces began to fall into place, those extra business trips every spring, the new credit card I found once in his jacket that he claimed was for office expenses, the way he had started locking his desk drawers a few years ago. He didn't just cheat, he invested in it. He built something else behind my back, brick by brick, while I was busy building the home we shared. I put everything back in the box, neatly, deliberately, and lowered the ladder. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't storm into the living room and throw the box at his feet like they do in those dramatic movies. No, I did something worse. I went downstairs, poured him another glass of sweet tea, and asked if he wanted dessert. He looked at me and smiled that same crooked smile that once made my heart flutter, and I smiled right back, because I had already decided what I was going to do next. That night, I lay in bed beside him, listening to the sound of his breathing, steady, rhythmic, content, as though nothing in the world could trouble a man who had so carefully compartmentalized his life. I stared at the ceiling for hours, the fan spinning slowly above us like a metronome, counting down to the moment when everything would change. I didn't sleep. I didn't even close my eyes. I just waited. I let my mind replay every glance, every excuse, every missing hour over the past 10, 15, 20 years, and with each memory, a new crack appeared in the version of our marriage I had clung to for far too long. The next morning, while he showered and whistled behind the door like he always did, I sat at the kitchen table and opened my laptop. The sun was barely up, but I didn't need coffee. My veins pulsed with something stronger: resolve. I searched for a lawyer, not one of those expensive downtown firms with shiny websites and celebrity clients, but someone smart, discreet, and familiar with the kind of deception that doesn't leave bruises on your skin, but leaves a bruise somewhere deeper. I found a woman named Linda Parker. Her reviews weren't flashy, but the words thorough, calm, and doesn't miss a detail showed up again and again. I made the call. By noon, I had an appointment for the following Monday. I told him I'd be out running errands. He didn't question it. In fact, he barely looked up from his phone. It was like I had become part of the wallpaper, reliable, familiar, and invisible. And that was fine. For now. Over the next few days, I played my part flawlessly. I made his favorite dinners, folded his laundry, even laughed at his tired stories, all while making copies of the photos, scanning the letters, organizing a small folder labeled "for attorney use." I dug through our financial records, found hidden accounts I hadn't noticed before. He wasn't careful. Not really. He had just trusted that I wasn't looking. But I was looking now. When Monday came, I dressed in a soft gray blouse and black slacks, something respectful but not too formal, and drove downtown to Linda's office. It was in a modest brick building tucked between a florist and an insurance agency, the kind of place you might overlook unless you were specifically looking for it. She greeted me with a warm handshake, a steady gaze, and an air of quiet confidence that immediately put me at ease. I handed her the folder without a word. She opened it, flipped through the contents, then looked up at me with a kind of expression I can only describe as both pity and admiration. She asked how long I had known. I told her a week. She raised an eyebrow, surprised. Then she asked how long I had suspected. That question was harder to answer. The truth was, I think some part of me had always known. Or maybe not known exactly, but sensed something wasn't right. The way he grew colder over the years, more distracted, less interested in the small things. He didn't touch my back when he walked past me in the kitchen anymore. He didn't ask about my garden. He started calling me Mom even when the kids weren't around, like my identity had dissolved into a role he no longer respected. These weren't red flags. They were gray ones. Soft, quiet warnings that I had ignored because they didn't scream. But now, they screamed. Linda was calm, focused. She laid out my options. Divorce, yes, but also protection of assets, quiet withdrawal of funds, a new will, one that excluded him entirely. I listened carefully, nodding slowly, the pieces fitting into place. For the first time in years, I felt like I was taking control not just of my future, but of myself. That evening, I came home and made spaghetti, just like I always did on Mondays. He walked in humming again, a new tune this time, and kissed my forehead. I asked about his day. He talked about a new project. I listened. And as we sat down to eat, he looked at me and said, "You've been so calm lately. It's nice, peaceful." I almost laughed, but I didn't. I just smiled and passed him the Parmesan, because peace, real peace, doesn't come from pretending. It comes from finally knowing exactly who you're dealing with and quietly preparing to walk away while they're still congratulating themselves for getting away with it. The next weekend arrived with a quiet kind of unease hanging in the air, the kind that you can't quite put your finger on but feel in your bones nonetheless. He spent the morning out in the garage, fiddling with tools he rarely used and pretending to be busy with something that didn't exist, while I swept the front porch and trimmed the potted plants by the door like I had every Saturday for the past 25 years. Everything looked the same from the outside, but inside our home, and inside me, something had changed permanently, and he felt it. I could see it in the way his eyes lingered on me just a moment longer, searching for something he couldn't name. I let him wonder. That afternoon, I mentioned casually that I had packed away the winter blankets in the attic. His eyes flicked upward toward the ceiling, like he'd forgotten we even had one. "The attic?" he asked, trying to keep his tone light. "You still go up there?" I smiled gently, my voice as even as the sky outside. "Of course. There's a lot of old things up there that need tending to." I could tell the words landed somewhere deep, but he didn't say anything else. Just nodded and went back to pretending to read the paper. Later that evening, while I baked a peach cobbler, his favorite, of course, I noticed the hallway light flick on near the staircase. I didn't move. I didn't follow. I simply waited, hands covered in flour, heart beating steady like it had practiced for this very moment. I heard the ladder creak, the soft thump of his footsteps climbing one by one, and then silence. 10 minutes passed, then 15. When he finally came back down, he walked into the kitchen slowly, like someone trying to act normal after falling into a hole. His hands were in his pockets, and his face held a strange combination of guilt and calculation. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. I slid the cobbler into the oven and wiped my hands on a dish towel before turning to him. "Find what you were looking for?" I asked, my voice as casual as the clinking of dishes in the sink. His mouth twitched. "I just, was looking for the old picnic set." I tilted my head, smiling. "Oh, I think that was donated years ago." I waited, and he finally nodded, clearly unsure of what to say next. He looked like a man who had stumbled into a conversation he wasn't prepared for, and worse, had no idea who had the upper hand anymore. That night, he was quiet. Too quiet. He sat on the edge of the bed for a long time before getting under the covers, staring at the wall like it might offer him instructions. I said nothing. I simply turned out the lamp and rolled onto my side, leaving him in the darkness he had created. The next day, he changed tactics. He brought home flowers, lilies, the kind he used to bring me back when we were first married, before the distractions, before the double life. He offered to cook dinner, which in his case meant ordering from that overpriced Italian place and putting it on plates like he'd made it himself. He even pulled out an old photo album from the closet and flipped through it at the table, reminiscing about our early years, our first house, the kids when they were small. I watched him carefully, every gesture, every sentence, and it became crystal clear. He was trying to rewrite the ending before it had even been written. He was trying to make me forget, but I hadn't forgotten. And I wasn't interested in his sudden nostalgia. What he didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that I had already made the final changes to my will. The house was now in a trust under my name alone. My savings had been moved into a separate account. I had even quietly contacted a notary to be on standby for documents I would deliver soon. My sister, bless her heart, had agreed to let me stay with her for a few weeks when the time came, no questions asked. And the lawyer? She was putting the final touches on the divorce paperwork and would be delivering them to me personally on Friday afternoon. He still thought he had a chance. He still believed that a few kind words, a box of lilies, and some takeout could undo what he had done. But what he hadn't realized, what so many men like him never seem to realize, is that once a woman truly sees the truth, no amount of sweet gestures can blind her again. Once the spell is broken, it stays broken. And while he tried to charm his way back into the version of life he thought he had under control, I simply waited. Because sometimes the sharpest revenge isn't loud or dramatic. Sometimes it's soft. Sometimes it's silent. And sometimes it's served by a woman who smiles sweetly across the dinner table, knowing full well that everything he thinks is his is already gone. That week passed like I was watching a strange little theater play, the kind where one actor keeps performing long after the curtain should have closed, still pretending there's an audience, still reciting his lines with too much effort and not enough meaning. My husband tried everything. He started doing the dishes without being asked, brought me flowers 2 days in a row, and even left a little note on my pillow one night, which probably would have meant something 10 years ago if I hadn't already seen the other life he'd been living behind my back. But now, each of his little gestures just confirmed how desperate he was to fix something he didn't even fully understand he had broken. And every smile he gave me felt more like an apology wrapped in denial than anything real. I let him continue. I smiled back. I made dinner. I folded the laundry with my usual care. But inside, I was already gone. The real me had packed up quietly and left long before the movers would come. I had already talked to Linda, the lawyer, and everything was in place. Friday at 3 p.m., she would hand-deliver the divorce papers to the house, and by then I would be far away, sitting in my sister's cozy little guest room 2 towns over, drinking tea and starting over with the only peace I had left. Every step I took that week was deliberate and quiet. I packed my things late at night while he was asleep, only the essentials: my clothes, family photos, my mother's jewelry, important documents, a few personal treasures tucked into a small suitcase that didn't make a sound when I wheeled it out to my car. I left behind the furniture, the kitchenware, the pictures on the walls, even our bedspread. I didn't want any of it. I wanted a clean break. A life that didn't smell like lies and old routines, a space where I could finally breathe without wondering where he really was when he said he was at a meeting. On Friday morning, everything looked just like it always did. I made breakfast, scrambled eggs, toast, and his usual black coffee. He sat across from me at the kitchen table, looking tired but trying to play normal, asking about the weather and mumbling something about checking the gutters this weekend. He didn't look at me much, just picked at his food like he had something on his mind but wasn't ready to speak it aloud. I could tell he felt the shift, even if he didn't know exactly what was coming. There was a stiffness in his shoulders, a question behind his eyes like he was waiting for me to say something, maybe to accuse him, maybe to forgive him. But I said nothing. I didn't need to. Everything I had to say was already written down on those papers, sealed in an envelope with his name on it. At exactly 2:45, I walked to the door, holding my bag in one hand and my keys in the other. I told him I needed to run a few errands. He nodded without looking up. I stepped outside and closed the door gently behind me. There was no dramatic slam, no shouting match, no final words, just silence. And that silence felt like freedom. It didn't feel like walking away from a home. It felt like walking out of a cage I had convinced myself was comfortable. By the time Linda arrived with the envelope, I was already gone. When he opened the door that afternoon and saw the envelope in Linda's hand, I imagined the first thing that hit him wasn't fear or guilt. It was confusion, the kind of stunned, slow confusion that only happens when someone realizes they've misread the entire situation. Maybe he thought it was a letter from a neighbor or something for the homeowners association, some small detail to brush aside like he always did. But the moment he saw her calm, professional face and the way she addressed him without hesitation, it must have clicked. And inside that thick white envelope with his name typed so neatly on the front, his entire illusion came crashing down. Every page inside held pieces of the life he'd been building in secret and the life he thought he still had under control. He probably read it once, then twice, hoping he'd misunderstood. But there it was: divorce, asset division, legal proof of a woman who didn't just know the truth, but had planned her escape right under his nose, while he was too busy pretending nothing was wrong. He called me later that night. 8 missed calls, then 10. Then a voicemail that started with my name and ended in silence. I didn't answer. I was sitting in my sister's guest room wrapped in a soft knitted blanket, sipping tea and listening to the wind brush against the trees outside her window, feeling more peaceful than I had in years. There was no need to hear his voice. I already knew everything he would say. He'd ask how I found out. He'd say it wasn't what it looked like. He'd claim he was confused, that it started a long time ago, that it didn't mean anything, or maybe he'd try to be angry, try to twist it back on me like it was my fault for not loving him enough, not listening, not being the woman he wanted. But none of it mattered anymore. The version of me that might have listened to that kind of talk was gone. She disappeared the day I looked through that hotel window and saw the man I married holding the hand of a child that could have been his grandson or his son. He didn't stop trying. Over the next few weeks, he sent flowers, cards, even letters, the kind he probably used to send to the other woman when she was upset. I recognized the phrases, the way he wrote like he was crafting a little story where he was the misunderstood hero. I didn't reply. I didn't need closure from him because I had already given it to myself. I had walked away on my own terms, with my dignity intact and my future wide open, and there was nothing left for me in the life I used to live except shadows and dust. My sister was kind enough to give me space, but not so much that I felt alone. She made me laugh again, reminded me of the parts of myself I had forgotten, and gave me back the sound of my own voice without it being drowned out by someone else's needs. I started taking walks in the evening, just to feel the air on my face and the quiet hum of a world that had kept turning, even while mine had cracked apart. And slowly, I realized something that startled me. I wasn't just recovering, I was waking up. One day, I found myself smiling at a stranger in the coffee shop. Not because I wanted anything from him, not because I was ready for something new, but because it felt good to simply exist again, to be seen as a person, not a role, to breathe without waiting for the next disappointment. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't even bitter. I was just done. And that was more powerful than any revenge I could have imagined. As for him, I heard through our son that he tried to explain everything, said he never meant to hurt me, that it got out of hand, that he still loved me in his own way. But even our son, who once idolized his father, couldn't look at him the same after that. There's a price to living two lives, and eventually, both fall apart. I didn't burn his things. I didn't scream in court. I didn't expose him to the world. I simply let the truth do what it always does. It rose to the surface, steady and undeniable. And once it did, I walked away. Not because I was weak, but because I was finally strong enough not to stay.